Hey everybody, welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. This is a little preview edition. I'm Jim Rugg, and this is a little preview edition of the Octobriana 1976 black and white edition, which is actually the Octobriana 1986 black and white explosion edition. So these just came today, and basically I'm going to take a look at them here on camera for everybody, but pretty excited. Anybody that's been following the channel knows that I have been working on a Kickstarter for Octobriana for a blacklight comic book for the last couple of months, I suppose. And the Kickstarter ended a couple weeks ago, and so I have started ordering all the different prints and printed matter that I am making as part of the Kickstarter, which involves blacklight poster prints, blacklight comic book. But in the process of making this Kickstarter, the Kickstarter itself went really well. There was a lot of support for it, and a couple of interesting print projects that came out of this Kickstarter include a black and white variant edition and a retro color variant edition. And so what happened is the blacklight comic uses fluorescent ink. It's designed for print. There really isn't a great way to show it off digitally. And so part of Kickstarter is having a PDF, as one of the reward levels, especially for comic books. I did some research on comic book Kickstarters, and that seemed to be one of the very common rewards that you needed to offer. And so I wanted to include that just because it seemed like a good practice for a comic book Kickstarter. And what that meant was trying to figure out how to make a good PDF version of this story. Something that would look good on screen, would look good on your iPads if that's, what you decided to support. And so in the process of making the digital versions, I ended up making, first of all, what turned into the retro color edition. The idea being this is a book that's set in the 1970s, so let's color it as if it were printed in the 1970s. And people that follow my work may be familiar with Aphrodisiac, which is another comic book I did set in the 1970s that uses a retro coloring process to make it look aged and old. And so this is the retro color print edition. What happened is once I started making these things and I made a black and white version, I started sharing these because I got very excited for making stuff. I'm sure anybody out there watching this who makes things can relate to that. You start making this stuff, you want to share it. So I was very excited by how these were turning out, and I started posting them on the Kickstarter updates and on Instagram. And a lot of people were interested in them and said, make a print edition of this stuff. And it's Kickstarter. It's pretty easy to add a reward, and if nobody wants it, no big deal. But my thinking was if 20 or 30 people wanted this, I would figure out a way to do like a limited print on demand, basically just make the best version I could make given, the budget of the number of people that supported this particular reward. I had the digital files, and so then it was a matter of, based on whatever the budget was, look at the best thing that I could produce within that budget range. And I was excited to make them. I talk a lot about like the black and white comics of the 80s, the black and white explosion that followed the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so, making a black and white version was something that appealed to me. I liked the way the retro edition looked. And so when people asked about doing a print version of them, I was game. The rewards went really well, and more than 20 or 30 people supported these two particular projects. And so it kind of opened up the options as to what I could actually make. I was not limited to print on demand, for example, because I had a budget that I could actually do offset printing. I could do a little bit of a higher print run, and I could go and kind of see, I don't know, if there was a wish list of things that I wanted to print or I wanted to try. This was the project that I might be able to explore some of those processes that I don't typically get to work with. And so in the case of the retro color edition, and there's another video where I really get into depth on this retro color edition because I got these back from the printer a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. So I've already made a little bit of a deeper dive in this particular book. But it was offset printed. You know, once I hit a certain quantity with the printer I was using, I was able to go to offset. So the biggest thing that allows me is a little better color quality, but a better paper surface, because the offset printing does not require coated paper. And a lot of the print on demand options, they use a heat treat transfer, kind of like a xerographic process, and it ends up with a coated like surface. It's like the ink sits on top of the page instead of going into it. So like I said, there's a bigger video on this one, a little deeper dive if you're interested in that subject. Hey, Adam Brooks, thanks, man. So the reason for this video today is the black and white editions came in, and I am so excited for these. So here's what I got to do with this. If you look at a lot of 80s black and white comics, like the Black and White Explosion, self-published, small publisher, indie comics, they're printed on newsprint. And newsprint is something that, it's very thin paper. It's obviously not considered high quality paper. It was just the cheapest way to print comic books for decades in the 20th century. But as the comics industry has changed and evolved, and printing has kind of changed and evolved, most comics have gotten away from printing on newsprint. Because the paper is so thin, you generally need to use a process called a web press, which is like newspapers are printed on this, another industry that's maybe not printing as many copies as they used to. But the web presses are giant rolls of newsprint. They're printed very quickly. Again, usually relatively low quality, although I think newsprint is better than it used to be, but it used to be very pulpy and just cheap paper. And so you don't find a lot of web presses, and when you do, you need to print in a large enough quantity to justify using them, because they could print, 1,000 books in half an hour or 10 minutes or something. I don't even know how long, but it would be a very quick process. And so once I had some orders for the black and white comic, I realized I might be able to actually print on newsprint using a web press. And one of the big inspirations for this is Ben Mara's comics. Let me pull out one of those right now. So I'm a fan of Ben Mara's work. This is an issue of Night Business that he had printed sometime in 2010. And so this is printed, I used the same printer that Ben used, and I reached out to him to, find out where he prints. And it's a printer in, I'm not sure if it's in Queens or Long Island, called Linko Printing. And, I was looking at some of my different black and white comics and thinking about what I liked and what I wanted to try printing. And whenever I started looking at Ben Mara's comics from like 2010, I thought, this is perfect. It's the newsprint on the inside, glossy cover. This is exactly the kind of stuff I like to go dig around in 50-cent boxes. So with that in mind, I reached out to Linko Printing. I got a quote. I wasn't even sure if they were still open. Printers come and go. And also with the COVID thing, a lot of printers had shut down, at least temporarily. Fortunately, Linko was still open. They got back to me with a quote that I was happy with. And I sent them files. And here we go. So I also posted a video several weeks ago showing some test black and white printings for this book. Originally, when I didn't have very many orders, my plan was to do a print on demand with a company, Best Value Copy, that I've used in the past. And so this book on the right is a test print from Best Value Copy. This is printed on an ivory paper, so just slightly off-white, but not real newsprint. And it was okay. If you're touching it, you can definitely feel a difference. Newsprint has this tactile quality that is unique to it. It has a certain weight that is very specific, and this is not the same. This is bond paper. It's just a heavier, stiffer stock. I was okay with it, but one of the reasons that I printed some samples is because I'm using this pattern for grayscale. And this pattern is a bunch of diagonal lines, sort of like duo shade paper, not exactly like duo shade, but along those kind of lines. And I wasn't sure if it would print without creating what's known as a moire effect. And if you look on this center spread, it did produce a little bit of a moire where this was just an even gray tone, but it actually, when it printed, the lines weren't printed perfectly. Sometimes patterns, whenever they're printed, if they're dots or if they're lines, they may be a higher resolution than the printer can handle, a greater detail than the printer can handle. And so as a result, you get this uneven pattern that can come out and create, again, what are known as moire effects. And so you see a little bit of that in the centerfold. And the reason I'm pointing it out is this was a test print to see how these patterns would print and look on paper. And so that had to be corrected for, like the full print run. And I was very excited with my solution. I'm sure, well, actually, I don't know how this is showing up on screen, but this is like a screen tone. So if you read a lot of manga, you'll see a lot of like gray areas in the artwork that are created with dots and patterns and stuff. And that stuff is usually applied, now it's usually applied digitally, but in the past it would come on these clear sheets that had an adhesive back, and you would put those down on the actual artwork and, cut out the shape that you wanted. So in this case, it'd be like the letter M. I have, I collect a lot of these old production technologies, and I have a lot of screen tone. And one of my screen tones is this concentric circles that just radiate outward. It's a really cool piece of screen tone. And so I scanned that, and I made my center point be the point of explosion right here. So I think it's a huge improvement over just some of these diagonal lines that I had in the original, and it printed perfectly. There's no moire pattern or anything. I didn't use the actual screen tone on the artwork. I scanned in the piece of screen tone and then applied that digitally for print, and I made it a little bit bigger, so you have this kind of like cool pattern of like these lines radiating out from the point of impact. So that's one of the reasons, you want to kind of test this stuff out, see what works, see what doesn't work, make little tweaks along the way. A lot of cartoonists talk about doing that. Sometimes whenever they serialize work, for example, Dan Clow's an 8-ball, and then it's collected in a graphic novel or trade paperback, a lot of artists will go back and they'll fix it. We just talked to Felipe Smith, a manga artist, and who does Pipochu, and he talked about serializing that in the monthly mangas, and then when it's collected in a book, you kind of go back and you maybe tweak little details, fix things up that didn't print as well as you wanted. And so that's the idea of doing like a print sample and then fixing that for the big print run. So I'm signing most of these comics, as many of these comics as I can possibly sign, and I've been trying to figure out different places to sign. For the retro color edition, I've been signing them on the back cover. There's a spot here that works pretty well. For the black and white edition, I think I'm signing it here on Octobriana's legs on page 1 with a ballpoint pen and with a little bit of color. That's the only non-black and white coloring in the book. I have a lot of, well, I don't have a lot, but I have a few comics from the 80s and things that are signed by creators. And I guess that was before everybody was signing books on the cover with Sharpies and metallic ink and things. And a lot of them are signed on like page 1. That newsprint's a very easy surface to write on. So I have a few of these old comics that have those signatures on page 1, and I always think that's really neat to open up a book. You get home and you open up this book, and then you find out that your American flag is signed by Howard Chaykin, or Scout is signed by Timothy Truman, and it'll be like on page 1. So I always liked how that looked, and that's my plan for these black and white versions. And like the retro color edition, I figure I'll flip through a couple of pages. There are some differences, minor differences art-wise. When you go from color to black and white and grayscale, it's definitely, you're playing with, in this case, I had mostly black, white, and then one gray value that I was using. So quite a bit different than, say, a palette with 8 or 10 or 12 colors like the 2 color editions that I'm doing. And the inside covers, I think I pointed out in the retro edition that I actually did a more saturated color for the inside cover because that's on cover stock. It's on a glossy paper, so your colors are going to print differently and appear differently than they do on the uncoated paper that's a little bit more desaturated. With that in mind, I did the same kind of treatment where, like, the inside cover art, I'm using some different patterning for the grayscale that is not going to be repeated throughout, but I do have a few patterns that I use. So this is similar to this cover pattern, and this is a little bit of a bigger, well, it's a lot bigger line pattern. I just thought it looked cooler. I had done a zine a couple years ago called BW. Let me see if I can pull one of those out real quick. Now what, I don't think I have one of those handy, unfortunately. Yeah, that's a shame. The BW zine had a line pattern that was similar to this or similar to this, and it was just a really cool, like, optical art kind of pattern. And so I wanted a bigger pattern of lines on the cover because of that BW cover, and I liked the effect and the way that looked. And so this is again taken from a screen tone, a sheet of screen tone that I scanned and then just laid on top of it for the actual printing. This is created specifically, this is in the color editions, but it's an effect that's created in Illustrator, and it's not a screen tone and it's not repeated throughout the book. It's just on this one part. This part is a like a dot pattern screen tone. I have a lot of dot pattern screen tones. I can't remember if I actually scanned this or if that's one that I made digitally, but it only appears on a couple of pages because once I started working on this, I came up with this 45-degree line screen tone, and I really liked the way it looked. It felt mechanical and cold and a little bit different than the typical screen tones that I would see in American comic books, and I wanted this to have a little bit of a different feel, like it was made, you know, behind the Iron Curtain, and the materials are just slightly different, even though there's a lot that is similar to the American comic counterparts. I wanted it to have a little bit of a feeling of strangeness and just slightly different. And so that's where I came up with this screen tone that I mostly use through the rest of the book. Really like how some of this stuff turns out. And again, I think of this as like coloring, right? But in the case of this, I have three colors. You know, I have black, white, and a gray. Those are my three colors. And so then, you know, you're weighing these compositions as to which of those three colors are you using for each element. So it's a little bit of a different thought process than working in full color or a couple of colors. But, you know, it's part of any kind of art making. I think you go through that process of creating certain parameters and then trying to get the most out of those parameters, you know, trying to make it look good. I think this is one of the panels that I would repeat a lot on social media. You know, I would show it in all of its different versions. And I've even made a one of my mixed media backing board pieces is based on that panel. So in the case of the backing board, it's watercolor, ballpoint pen, color pencil. I never know how far I want to go through this because I don't want to give away the whole story here. I know I stopped myself on previous flip throughs, but I do want to give everybody a taste, and I guess I can go up to this panel, up to this page since I talked about it. So that's that's the walkthrough, man. You know, like I said, these arrived half an hour ago. I've been waiting 2 days for them, you know, since I got the shipping notice. And I'm pretty thrilled with them. First time printing with a web press, first time printing on real newsprint. So I had a couple of things that I wasn't sure about. You know, I wasn't sure. There's something called dot gain with any kind of printing, and what that refers to is whenever the ink hits the page, it spreads a little bit. You know, it bleeds into the paper. And so depending on what kind of paper stock you're using, it could bleed a lot or it could bleed a little. Newsprint is something that tends to bleed a lot. And so I was not sure how some of these patterns were going to print. My biggest fear was that the gray might be very, very dark. And I'm happy with how this turned out. I'm pretty thrilled with it. I don't know, this is the first time, like I said, that I've printed on actual newsprint like this. And it's something that I'm excited for. So happy I got to make this as a result of the Kickstarter. So again, thank you to everybody that supported, especially this reward, because I'm thrilled I finally got to use this process and make a comic like a lot of those 80s black and white books that I adore. I don't know if I'll do another project like this, or when I might do another project like this. I don't have anything on my schedule quite like this one. So I'm very excited that I got a chance to work with this process and this printer. They did a great job. Thank you to Linko Printing for kind of walking me through this, making some adjustments whenever after I had sent them files. I changed some stuff. The one change that I made after I had approved my proof was to add the 86 rather than the 76. Just a little homage to a special year in comics, at least in my mind, a special year in comics. So kind of fun to throw that little homage to 1986 onto this book cover. And that's it. If you see this and you're excited by it, you can still pre-order these from me. My pre-order is available on Octobriana1976.backerkit.com. That will be open until July 21st, so about a week to go on that. After that, one of the things that we're going to do with comic book shops is make these available to any comic shops that order 10 copies of the Blacklight edition will receive a set of these variants for free. So if you want to order this through your comic shop, let them know about it. One of the challenges is trying to get this kind of information out to comic shop owners. There's so much information about comics all the time and so much for everybody to stay on top of. So if that is something that sounds good to you, please pass it on to your local comic shop. Otherwise, like I said, you can find it at Octobriana1976.backerkit.com. You can also find the Blacklight edition, which I saw some proofs this week. I can't wait to make a video of that. I can't wait to see that book in person. Excited to try to figure out how to get that on camera and make it look good. Maybe I'll use a real blacklight for it. So pieces are still rolling in, but you can find all of this right now through BackerKit. And along with the blacklight posters, I'm doing 3 of those in conjunction with this Kickstarter. You can still order those posters. Those are going to press right now. So I actually talked to the printer about that this week. So a lot of moving parts, but things are coming in. It seems like something's coming in every week now. Very exciting. Again, if you're into making like I am, this is the most exciting part of the project. So I'm so excited to see this. And anytime I print something or I send something off to the printer, there's a huge level of anxiety, whenever you're waiting for it to come in. Whenever it shows up and it all prints well and prints the way you wanted it to, it's very exciting. So that's the reason for the mood here. And that's about all I have for now. I will keep everybody, up to date on through Instagram, through the Kickstarter updates. Everything's still on schedule at this point for me to start shipping in late July or first week of August. So things are going well so far. Thank you again to everybody that has backed and supported this project. If you're not into Kickstarter and pre-ordering this stuff online, you can get it through your comic shops. This is available for pre-order through comic shops right now. So if you prefer to get it through your comic shop, please do that. Let them know that you want a copy of Octobriana 1976, and they can order that for you right now. And until next time, read more comics.